My 2-year-old son Oliver was singing his made-up breakfast song, blissfully unaware that his father had just demolished our family with a single email. The subject line read simply, "Moving forward." I nearly choked on my tea when I opened the attachment and saw the photo. Michael, my husband of 7 years, had his arms wrapped around a young blonde woman who couldn't have been more than 23. They were standing on the deck of our mountain cabin, the retreat we'd purchased last summer, with my inheritance money, the same place where we'd spent countless weekends planning our future together, where Michael had promised we'd watch our children grow up during summer vacations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "The cabin is mine now," the email declared. "I've already moved in with Vanessa. My lawyer will be contacting you about the divorce papers. Don't waste your time fighting it. The deed is in my name." My hands trembled as I set down my mug, but not from fear. No, this was pure, white-hot rage building inside me. Michael really thought he could just email me divorce papers and steal our vacation home? The home I'd paid for with money my grandmother left specifically to me? He had no idea what was coming. I looked at our son, still innocent and happy, smashing banana into his high chair tray. His dark curls and bright eyes were so much like mine, nothing like Michael's sandy hair and pale blue eyes. Oliver giggled as he caught me watching him, extending a sticky hand toward me with a half-eaten piece of banana as an offering. "No thank you, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "Mommy's not hungry right now." I glanced at the framed photo on our kitchen wall, Michael and me on our wedding day, both smiling like we had forever figured out. I was 26 then, fresh out of law school, and convinced I'd found a partner who valued my ambitions as much as his own. 7 years of marriage, and this was how he chose to end it, with a smug email and a photo of himself with a woman young enough to be one of his students from the university where he taught. The cabin in Bend, Oregon had been my dream. 3 bedrooms nestled among pine trees, overlooking a crystal-clear lake. I'd found it. I'd negotiated the price down, and I'd paid for it with the inheritance my grandmother had left specifically to me. Michael had insisted his name be on the deed for simplicity's sake, a decision I'd reluctantly agreed to after he'd promised it would always be our special family place. I took a deep breath and picked up my phone, scrolling through recent messages from Michael. Looking back, the signs were painfully obvious. Canceling our family weekend plans, working late, the sudden conference 3 weeks ago that he couldn't quite explain when I asked for details. My finger hovered over Michael's contact information for a moment before I clicked block. Then I opened my email and typed 3 simple sentences in reply. "Interesting assumption about the cabin. You might want to double-check the paperwork, carefully." I hit send, blocked his email too, and turned back to my son with a smile. Michael had always underestimated me. He saw me as the accommodating wife who'd put her promising legal career on hold to support his professorship and raise our child. He probably thought I'd collapse in tears, maybe beg him to reconsider. But he'd forgotten one crucial detail about me. I didn't earn my law degree by being naive about protecting assets, especially ones that were never jointly owned in the first place. The truth was that before I'd agreed to put Michael's name on the deed, I'd quietly filed additional paperwork with my old law school friend, Teresa, who specialized in family law. She'd helped me create a separate agreement stipulating that despite the deed's appearance, the cabin remained my sole property as it was purchased entirely with my inheritance funds. Michael had signed it without reading it thoroughly, too busy preparing for the new semester to pay attention to what he'd called boring legal details. I wiped Oliver's hands and face, lifted him from his high chair, and carried him to the living room playpen. As he happily grabbed for his favorite stuffed giraffe, I walked to my home office and closed the door partway, keeping an eye on him through the gap. My legal instincts had never quite disappeared during my years as a stay-at-home mom. I kept meticulous records of everything, a habit from my brief but successful time at a top Portland law firm. From my desk drawer, I pulled out a folder labeled Assets and flipped through until I found the cabin documentation. There it was, the separate ownership agreement with Michael's hasty signature at the bottom. I scanned it and emailed it to Teresa with a brief message. Emergency. Call me ASAP. Then I began methodically checking our joint accounts. That's when the second blow hit. Our shared savings account, the one where we'd been depositing money, for Oliver's education, was empty. All $50,000 gone. Transferred yesterday to an account I didn't recognize. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered, the rage inside me crystallizing into something cold and focused. I heard Oliver babbling to his toys in the living room as I opened my laptop and logged into our investment account. That, too, had been drained. Another $75,000 gone. Michael had been busy. I should have seen this coming. Michael's behavior had changed subtly over the past few months. More secretive about his phone, working late more often, suggesting separate vacations to maintain our independence. I'd attributed it to the stress of his tenure review, to his midlife crisis as he approached 40. How naive I'd been. I pulled out my phone again and texted Teresa. "Check all joint accounts too. He's emptied savings and investments." The reply came almost immediately. "On it. Don't do anything yet. Document everything." I leaned back in my chair, taking deep breaths to calm myself. Through the doorway, I could see Oliver standing in his playpen, clutching the bars and calling, "Mama, Mama," his signal that he was ready to come out and explore. I walked over and lifted him into my arms, inhaling the sweet baby shampoo smell of his hair. "It's okay, little man," I whispered. "Mommy's got this. We're going to be just fine." As I held my son, my mind was already racing ahead. Michael thought he'd orchestrated the perfect exit, taking our money, taking our vacation home, discarding his family for a younger model. He clearly expected me to fall apart, to be the emotional wreck he could point to when justifying his actions. He had no idea what was coming, because while Michael had been planning his escape with Vanessa, he'd made one critical mistake. He'd forgotten who he married. I wasn't just the supportive faculty wife who organized department dinners and raised his child. I was Rachel Winters, former rising star at Bennett and Phelps Law, and I was about to remind him what happens when you cross a woman who made her living, anticipating every possible angle in a case. As Oliver played with his blocks on the living room rug, I paced the floor of our Portland home, my mind racing through options. The colonial-style house that had once felt like the perfect family home now seemed to echo with Michael's betrayal in every corner. Teresa called just as I was pouring myself a second cup of tea. "Rachel, I've reviewed everything you sent. First, good news. That separate agreement on the cabin is solid. Michael can claim it's his all he wants, but legally it remains your sole property as inheritance. Now, for the concerning part, the account transfers are a problem. How soon can you come to my office?" "I'll need to arrange childcare for Oliver," I said, watching my son stack blue and red blocks into a wobbly tower. "Maybe by noon?" "Perfect. And Rachel? Bring any financial records you have. Bank statements, investment papers, tax returns, everything." After hanging up, I called Diane, our regular babysitter who lived 2 streets over. She agreed to be at our house within the hour. While waiting, I methodically gathered documents from my home office. 7 years of marriage compressed into folders of financial statements and legal papers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Michael, the romantic literature professor who'd wooed me with Shakespearean sonnets, had reduced our life together to cold transactions. I found our most recent tax returns and paused. There was something odd about the numbers. Michael's university salary was substantial, He was a tenured professor with a distinguished chair in the English department. But these figures seemed inflated. I set them aside to show Teresa. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Rachel, it's Michael. Since you've blocked my regular number, I had to use my new phone. Stop playing games. The cabin is mine. I've already consulted with my attorney. If you try to fight this, I'll seek full custody of Oliver. Think about what's best for our son." I felt my heart rate spike, but forced myself to breathe deeply. This was classic intimidation, a tactic I'd seen countless times. In my legal career, men like Michael always believed they held all the cards. I didn't respond, simply blocking this number too. Let him think I was panicking. Oliver's tower of blocks collapsed, and he looked up at me with a momentary flash of frustration before giggling and starting over. His resilience struck me, how children can rebuild without dwelling on what fell before. I needed that same clarity. Diane arrived promptly at 10:30, her gray hair pulled back in her usual neat bun, a bag of Oliver's favorite books in hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," I said, leading her to the living room. "It's no trouble at all," she replied, already kneeling beside Oliver. "We're going to have a wonderful time, aren't we, sweetheart?" As I gathered my purse and the folders, Diane called after me. "Oh, Rachel, I forgot to mention, I saw Michael yesterday afternoon downtown with a young lady. I assumed she was one of his students." I froze. "Yesterday afternoon? Are you sure?" "Positive. Around 3 p.m. outside that new bistro on Pearl Street. They seemed quite familiar with each other." Diane's expression was sympathetic but uncomfortable. I debated whether to mention it, but "No, I appreciate you telling me," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "Did you notice anything else?" "Well, they were looking at something on her phone. They seemed very excited about it. Property listings, maybe? The screen looked like a real estate website." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Michael wasn't just stealing our cabin. He was already planning their next home together, probably using our joint funds. "Thank you, Diane. Please call if Oliver needs anything. I should be back by late afternoon." The drive to Teresa's downtown office gave me time to strategize. Michael's threat about custody was his weakest move. He'd barely changed a diaper in 2 years, couldn't name Oliver's pediatrician, and had missed his last 3 checkups due to unavoidable departmental meetings. No judge would award him custody when the evidence of his minimal involvement was so abundant. Teresa's office occupied the 10th floor of a sleek glass building overlooking the Willamette River. As the elevator ascended, I caught my reflection. In its mirrored wall, dark circles under my eyes, hair hastily pulled into a ponytail, wearing the same sweater I'd thrown on yesterday. I straightened my shoulders. Appearances didn't matter now. Strategy did. Teresa greeted me with a quick hug before ushering me into her corner office. At 45, she exuded the confidence that came from 2 decades of handling Portland's most contentious divorces. "You look better than I expected," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I'm saving my breakdown for after I secure our future," I replied, opening my briefcase. Teresa nodded approvingly. "That's the Rachel I remember from law school. Now, let's talk about what Michael's done and how we're going to respond." Over the next hour, we methodically reviewed my financial situation. The news was mixed. While Michael had indeed emptied our joint savings and investment accounts, approximately $125,000 in total, he hadn't been able to access my personal account, where I'd deposited the remainder of my inheritance. "This is clearly financial misconduct," Teresa said, making notes. "The court doesn't look kindly on spouses who drain joint accounts on the eve of divorce proceedings. We'll file for an emergency hearing and asset freeze." I nodded, then pushed the tax returns across her desk. "There's something else. The income reported here doesn't match what Michael should be earning." Teresa examined the documents, her eyebrows rising. "You're right. This is nearly double his university salary, Any idea where the extra money is coming from? None, I admitted. Michael handles all our tax filings. I've been so focused on Oliver these past 2 years, I just signed where he told me to. Teresa tapped her pen against the desk. We need to investigate this. Could be consulting, work, investments, or something he doesn't want scrutinized. I finished her thought. Exactly. I'll have my investigator look into it. She made another note. Now, about the cabin. Your separate agreement is solid, but Michael being on the deed complicates things. We'll need to file an action to quiet title. As Teresa outlined our legal strategy, my phone buzzed with another text from an unfamiliar number. Rachel, it's Vanessa. Michael suggested I reach out woman to woman. He says you're being difficult about the cabin. We've already moved most of our things in and planned renovations. Can't we be adults about this? I wordlessly handed my phone to Teresa, who read the message and gave a short, disbelieving laugh. The audacity, she muttered. Don't respond. Document everything. This kind of harassment works in our favor. I took back my phone, taking a screenshot of the message before blocking this number too. Diane, our babysitter, saw them yesterday. Looking at real estate listings. They're planning their next move already. Of course they are, Teresa said grimly. Men like Michael always have the next step mapped out before they detonate the current situation. She was right. Michael had always been meticulous in his planning. It was one of the qualities that had attracted me initially. He'd charmed me 7 years ago at a university fundraiser where I'd been representing my law firm. His confidence, his articulate passion for literature, the way he'd quoted Jane Austen when asking for my number. It had all seemed so genuine then. Rachel? Teresa's voice pulled me from my thoughts. There's something else we need to discuss. Your career. I looked up, surprised by the shift. My career? You've been out of practice for almost 3 years now. Given what Michael's done, you're going to need financial independence, and quickly. Have you thought about returning to law? The question caught me off guard. When Oliver was born, Michael and I had decided together that I would take extended leave from my firm. The plan had been for me to return part-time once Oliver started preschool next year. But now, I don't know if any firm would take me after this gap, I said honestly. Teresa's expression softened. Rachel, you were one of the sharpest attorneys in our graduating class. Your work on the Westlake case was brilliant. Skills like yours don't disappear. They just need dusting off. She leaned forward. In fact, I've been meaning to talk to you about joining my practice. We've been expanding our family law division and could use someone with your background in contract law. The offer stunned me. Are you serious? Completely. Obviously, we'd need to work around your situation with Oliver, but we're flexible with hours and have excellent childcare benefits. She smiled. Think about it. Not only would it provide you with financial security, but there's a certain poetic justice in you practicing family law after what Michael's pulled. For the first time since opening that devastating email, I felt a flicker of hope. Not just for surviving this betrayal, but for rebuilding something better from its ashes. I'll definitely consider it, I said, already imagining the look on Michael's face when he discovered I'd returned to law, and specifically to family law. Good. Now, Teresa slid a legal pad toward me. I need you to write down everything you remember about Michael's schedule over the past 6 months. When he claimed to be working late, any trips to the cabin, anything unusual. We're building a timeline. As I began writing, the office door opened and Teresa's assistant entered with a folder. The initial search results on Professor Winters that you requested, she said quietly, handing it to Teresa. Teresa skimmed the contents, her expression shifting from professional interest to concern. She dismissed her assistant with a nod before looking up at me. Rachel, does Michael have a research grant with Westlake Publishing? Not that I know of. His work is primarily on early American literature, Westlake specializes in contemporary fiction. Why? Teresa slid a document across to me. Because according to this, Michael received a $200,000 grant from Westlake 6 months ago for a book project. The grant was disbursed in full, but there's no record of the book being delivered. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. 6 months. Go! Right around when Michael had started his pattern of working late and making trips to the cabin alone. Is there any connection between Westlake Publishing and anyone named Vanessa? I asked, a suspicion forming. Teresa's assistant must have been listening at the door because she reappeared almost immediately. I can answer that. Vanessa Thornfield is the daughter of Richard Thornfield, CEO of Westlake Publishing. The pieces were falling into place. Michael hadn't just fallen for a younger woman. He'd strategically positioned himself with the daughter of a publishing executive, secured a substantial grant, and now was attempting to start a new life using our joint assets and my inheritance. He's been planning this for months, I said, the cold fury returning. This wasn't some impulsive affair. This was calculated. Teresa closed the folder, which makes his actions even more egregious in the eyes of the court. Rachel, I think it's time we stop playing defense. Tomorrow morning, we're filing for emergency orders on the financial accounts, securing your rights to the cabin, and requesting full financial disclosure. Michael wants to play hardball? Let's show him what that really means. As I left Teresa's office an hour later, I felt fundamentally changed. The shell-shocked woman who had opened that email this morning was gone. In her place stood someone familiar, the strategic, meticulous attorney I had been before setting my career aside. Michael had made a critical error in his calculations. He'd forgotten who he was dealing with. Looking back, I should have seen this coming. The signs were there, scattered throughout the past year like breadcrumbs leading to this inevitable conclusion. But I had been too busy juggling motherhood and maintaining our home to notice what was happening right in front of me. The drive back from Teresa's office gave me time to reflect on all the moments that should have triggered my suspicions. The late nights at the university that had gradually increased from once a week to 3 or 4 times. The sudden interest in his appearance, new clothes, an expensive watch I'd never seen before, a change in cologne, the way he'd started keeping his phone face down and taking calls in another room. There had been that weekend in March when he'd claimed to be attending an academic conference in Seattle. I'd called his hotel room one evening when Oliver was particularly fussy, hoping Michael could talk to him for a few minutes. The hotel had no record of a Michael Winters staying there. When I confronted him later, he'd explained that he'd stayed with a colleague instead to save the department money. It had seemed plausible at the time. Budget cuts at the university had been in the news. I pulled into our driveway, noticing for the first time how Michael's prized hydrangeas were wilting from neglect. Even his garden had become a lower priority. As his double life expanded, Diane greeted me at the door, Oliver balanced on her hip. "We've had a lovely day," she said, her eyes searching my face for signs of distress. "He's had lunch and a nap, though it was shorter than usual." "Thank you, Diane. I really appreciate it." As I took Oliver from her arms, she hesitated. "Rachel, there's something else I should mention. While Oliver was napping, I answered a call to your home phone. It was a woman asking for Michael. She said her name was Vanessa and that she was calling from the cabin about some furniture delivery. I told her Michael wasn't here, and she seemed surprised that I wasn't you." I felt a familiar clenching in my stomach. "What did you tell her?" "Just that I was the babysitter." She hung up rather abruptly after that. Diane looked troubled. "Rachel, is everything all right? It's none of my business, of course, but—" "No, it's fine." I forced a smile. "Michael and I are going through some changes. I may need your help with Oliver more often in the coming weeks." After paying Diane and seeing her out, I carried Oliver to the kitchen, settling him in his high chair with some apple slices while I prepared dinner. The normalcy of the routine felt surreal against the backdrop of my crumbling marriage. I pulled chicken from the refrigerator, remembering the night. 6 months ago when Michael had suggested we open a separate account for a surprise he was planning. He'd been so convincing, so enthusiastic about wanting to set aside money for a special family vacation for our upcoming anniversary. I'd agreed without hesitation, even contributing my own portion from my personal savings. That account must have been the beginning of his exit strategy, the first step in separating our finances without raising suspicions. My phone rang. Teresa. Rachel, we've found something interesting. My investigator did some digging into Westlake Publishing's grant program. Turns out the $200,000 grant Michael received isn't part of their regular academic funding. It was approved directly by Richard Thornfield as a special project outside their normal review process. Let me guess. This special project began around the time Michael would have met Vanessa? Exactly. According to their social media, Westlake held a faculty reception at the university's English department last September. Both Richard and Vanessa Thornfield were in attendance, as was Michael. September, 8 months ago, when Michael had come home unusually energized about a game-changing connection he'd made at a departmental function. There's more, Teresa continued. The grant money was deposited into an account at Pacific Northwest Bank, not the university's normal grant management system. We're working on getting those records. Can we use this in the divorce proceedings? Absolutely. If he obtained this grant under false pretenses or used his relationship with Vanessa to secure funding, it could be considered marital fraud. Plus, if he's hidden these funds from you, that's another strike against him. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and did something I'd never done before. I logged into Michael's email account. We'd shared passwords early in our marriage, a gesture of transparency that Michael had apparently abandoned while I still honored it. I braced myself for what I might find. His inbox revealed months of correspondence with Vanessa, dating back to October. The early emails were cautious, professional, discussions about American literature and publishing trends. But by November, the tone had shifted dramatically. I can't stop thinking about you, he'd written on November 17th. Our conversation last night changed everything for me. Vanessa's reply had been equally ardent. I feel the same way. I've never connected with anyone the way I do with you. When can we meet again? Somewhere more private than the campus cafe? I scrolled through their exchanges, watching their affair unfold in real time. The first meeting at the cabin had been in December. He'd told me he needed a weekend alone to work on his book proposal. By January, they were discussing how complicated his home situation was. By March, they were planning a future together. Rachel doesn't understand my work or my ambitions, he'd written in one particularly painful email. She's completely absorbed in domesticity now. We barely have anything in common anymore. I thought about the nights I'd spent proofreading his articles while he slept, the department events I'd organized to help his career, the way I'd supported his pursuit of tenure, even when it meant putting my own professional goals on hold. The injustice of his characterization burned, but it was an email from April that truly revealed the extent of their plotting. The grant money is secure in the separate account, Michael had written. Richard says there's a procedural audit coming. Up, but not to worry. He's handled it. Once the book contract is finalized next month, we can move forward with our plans. Rachel suspects nothing about the cabin paperwork. She never reads legal documents carefully. I closed the laptop, feeling nauseated. The casual conspiracy of it all, the confident assertion that I was too distracted or too trusting to notice what was happening. The worst part was that he'd been right. I hadn't noticed. Oliver had finished his apple slices and was banging his hands on the high chair tray, ready for the next course. I placed some steamed carrots before him, marveling at how he could remain so perfectly himself amid such chaos. Children live entirely in the present, a skill I desperately needed to relearn. I checked our home phone messages while Oliver ate. 3 calls from numbers I didn't recognize, probably Michael using different phones to try to reach me. 1 call from the university's department secretary wondering if everything was all right, as Michael had unexpectedly canceled his classes for the week. And 1 from a furniture delivery company confirming tomorrow's delivery to the cabin address. Tomorrow. They were furnishing the cabin tomorrow with what was undoubtedly our money, moving forward with their plans as if the outcome was already determined. I called Teresa again. Michael and Vanessa are having furniture delivered to the cabin tomorrow. Can we stop it? Better than that? Teresa replied. We can use it. I'll have someone there to document everything. What's delivered, who signs for it, all of it. This helps establish his intent to convert the property for his personal use despite your clear ownership. Keep monitoring his emails if you can do so without him knowing. And Rachel? Don't engage with him directly yet, no matter how much he tries to contact you. After Teresa and I finished strategizing, I fed Oliver the rest of his dinner, gave him a bath, and read him his favorite bedtime story twice. The routine was comforting, a small pocket of normalcy in a day that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of my life. Once Oliver was asleep, I returned to Michael's emails. There were several new exchanges between him and Vanessa from just this afternoon, growing increasingly panicked. Rachel's not responding to any of my messages, he'd written at 3:14 p.m., and her lawyer friend Teresa Hayes just requested all my financial records going back 3 years. How would she even know about those accounts? Vanessa's reply had been less than sympathetic. Dad says you need to get this under control immediately. He can't afford any connection to financial impropriety right now, not with the merger talks underway. Fix this, Michael. Their concern gave me a grim satisfaction. Let them worry. Let them wonder how much I knew and what I planned to do with that knowledge. I continued digging through his email archives, uncovering more evidence of their months-long deception. In early February, Michael had written to a real estate agent in Lake Oswego, one of Portland's most exclusive suburbs, inquiring about lakefront properties in the $1.5 million range. We're looking for something ready by summer, he'd written. Money is no object for the right place. Money is no object. On a professor's salary and a one-time grant? The audacity was breathtaking. There were emails to private schools in the same area, inquiring about admission procedures and costs for the following academic year. Was he planning to seek custody of Oliver after all? Or, the thought hit me with sudden clarity, was Vanessa pregnant? I searched frantically through their recent exchanges but found no explicit confirmation. What I did find was a draft email to me, never sent, dated just 2 days ago. Rachel, by the time you read this, Vanessa and I will be settled. At the cabin, I've struggled with how to tell you this, but I've found the kind of passionate connection I thought only existed in the literature I teach. I know this will be difficult, but I hope you can accept that our marriage has run its course. I'm prepared to be generous in the divorce settlement if you don't fight me on custody or the cabin. Vanessa's father has connections that could make things very uncomfortable for you professionally if you choose to be difficult about this. I hope it won't come to that. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Michael thought he could intimidate me with Richard Thornfield's influence. He still believed I would fold under pressure, that my priority would be avoiding conflict rather than fighting for what was rightfully mine and Oliver's. I forwarded the draft email to Teresa with a simple message: more evidence of premeditation and attempted coercion. Her reply was immediate. Perfect. This strengthens our case for the emergency hearing. Get some rest, Rachel. Tomorrow we start pushing back. Sleep seemed impossible, but I tried anyway, settling into the bed that Michael and I had shared for 7 years. I'd removed his pillow, unable to bear the lingering scent of his cologne, the new one he'd started wearing in January. January, when their affair had been in full bloom. As I drifted between wakefulness and uneasy sleep, I thought about the careful timeline of Michael's betrayal. the strategic deployment of lies and half-truths, the calculated risk of taking our joint savings based on his assumption that I wouldn't fight back effectively. If there was one silver lining to this devastating day, it was the rediscovery of a part of myself I'd allowed to go dormant, the analytical, strategic attorney who could see 3 moves ahead in any negotiation. Michael had been playing checkers, making bold moves without considering the long game. But I had been trained in chess, and I was just beginning to position my pieces. Tomorrow would bring the first real countermove, the emergency hearing, the documentation of their furniture delivery, the formal beginning of divorce proceedings. Michael and Vanessa thought their path forward was clear. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Dawn broke with the gentle sounds of Oliver stirring in his crib. I'd slept fitfully, my dreams filled with snippets of those damning emails and imagined scenes of Michael and Vanessa laughing at my expense. But as I lifted my son from his crib, his sleepy smile and outstretched arms grounded me in what truly mattered. "Good morning, my little man," I whispered, breathing in his warm, sweet scent. Oliver patted my face with his small hands, a morning ritual that never failed to center me. In his eyes, I was still whole, still strong. Not the betrayed wife whose world had imploded just yesterday. For him, I needed to be the mother who could weather any storm. I carried him to the changing table, my mind already mapping out the day ahead. Teresa had scheduled an emergency hearing for 2 p.m., and her investigator would be at the cabin by 10 a.m. to document the furniture delivery. Diane was coming at noon to watch Oliver during the hearing. "We've got a busy day, buddy," I told him as I fastened his dinosaur-patterned shirt. "But we're going to be okay." After settling Oliver with his breakfast, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, Michael's persistent attempts to reach me, and an email from Teresa with attachments. "Preliminary financial investigation results," the subject line read. I opened it immediately. Teresa's investigator had uncovered 2 additional bank accounts in Michael's name, opened within the last 6 months. One at Pacific Northwest Bank containing the $200,000 Westlake grant, now down to approximately $75,000. The second, more concerning account was at an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, with deposits totaling just over $300,000. The figure struck me like a physical blow. Where had that money come from? Even with the grant and our drained joint accounts, the math didn't add up. A text from Teresa followed. "Just received notice that Michael has retained Bradford Mills as his attorney. Aggressive choice. He's signaling he's ready for a fight. Are you still up for our 10 a.m. prep meeting?" Bradford Mills had a reputation as one of Portland's most ruthless divorce attorneys, specializing in protecting wealthy clients, particularly men, from what he famously called financial bloodletting in divorce proceedings. His retainer alone was rumored to be $50,000. I texted back my confirmation for the meeting, then returned to the kitchen where Oliver was methodically dropping pieces of banana onto the floor for some inscrutable toddler reason. "That's not how we eat banana, sweetheart," I said automatically, bending to clean up the mess. As I knelt on the floor, gathering sticky pieces of fruit, I caught sight of something I hadn't noticed before. Tucked behind the waste bin was a crumpled receipt that had missed the trash. I smoothed it out, immediately recognizing Michael's handwriting on the back. V. Dinner 7:30, bring cabin sketches. The receipt itself was from Cartier, dated 3 weeks ago for a love bracelet costing $6,500. My birthday had been 2 weeks ago. Michael had given me a cookbook and taken me to dinner at a moderately priced restaurant, claiming budget constraints due to some unexpected university expense. I pocketed the receipt and finished cleaning up, my resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about the money or even the betrayal anymore. It was about the calculated cruelty of a man who could buy his mistress jewelry while pretending financial hardship to his wife, who could plot a lavish new life while preparing to strip me of financial security, Who could potentially separate Oliver from his home and stability for his own selfish desires? I looked at my son, now happily mashing the remaining banana into an artistic smear across his high-chair tray. He was the image of innocence, unaware that his father was systematically dismantling the future we'd planned for him. The college fund, now empty. The cabin where he should have spent summers learning to swim and hike. The financial security that should have been his birthright. The protective instinct that surged through me was primal and clarifying. Michael could hurt me, could betray me, could even attempt to humiliate me. But I would not allow him to compromise. Oliver's future. Not without the fight of his life. I snapped a photo of the receipt before tucking it into my growing file of evidence, then finished preparing Oliver and myself for the day. As I dressed in one of my old professional outfits, a tailored charcoal suit that still fit perfectly, I felt myself stepping back into a role I'd temporarily set aside, but never forgotten. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror wasn't just Michael's soon-to-be ex-wife or Oliver's devoted mother. She was Rachel Winters, attorney at law, someone who understood the strategic chess game that divorce proceedings often became. Michael might have Bradford Mills, but I had something more valuable: the truth, meticulously documented, and the righteous anger of a mother protecting her child's future. Teresa's office was already bustling when I arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, Oliver in tow until Diane could pick him up. Her assistant immediately produced a set of toy blocks and a plastic dinosaur collection, setting Oliver up in a corner of Teresa's spacious office with practiced ease. "We're used to emergency client situations with children," she explained with a sympathetic smile. "There's a reason we keep better toys than most pediatric waiting rooms." Teresa entered, today dressed in a crimson suit that somehow conveyed both authority and a subtle warning. She greeted Oliver with a quick high five, before turning to me. "Bradford Mills filed a motion this morning," she said without preamble, handing me a document. "He's requesting temporary exclusive possession of the cabin pending final divorce proceedings, claiming it as Michael's primary workspace essential for his upcoming book deadline." I skimmed the filing, noting the carefully crafted language positioning. Michael as the hard-working academic whose productivity was essential to the family's financial well-being. The implication was clear. My contribution as a stay-at-home mother was financially insignificant compared to his professional work. "He's laying groundwork for a favorable property division," I observed. "Exactly," Teresa nodded approvingly. "But we've anticipated this. Our counterfiling is ready, including the inheritance documentation and the separate agreement. Plus, we've uncovered something interesting about that Cayman account." She produced another document, bank transfer records showing withdrawals from Michael's secondary account at Pacific Northwest, moving systematically to the offshore account. He started these transfers 6 months ago, right after receiving the grant. Small amounts initially, 5 or 10,000, then larger sums as recently as 3 days ago. We believe he's been using the grant money for personal expenses and to fund his exit strategy. "Can we prove the grant itself was fraudulently obtained?" I asked, thinking of the emails suggesting Richard Thornfield had facilitated it outside normal channels. "We're working on it. If we can demonstrate that Michael received these funds through his relationship with Vanessa rather than legitimate academic merit, we could potentially classify it as a form of marital fraud." Teresa checked her watch. "But right now, I just received word that our investigator is in position at the cabin. The furniture delivery truck has arrived. Let's see what happens." She turned her laptop toward me, revealing a live feed from a vehicle parked across from the cabin. The camera showed a high-end furniture delivery truck in the driveway and 2 men unloading what appeared to be a leather sectional sofa. "Is this legal?" I asked, watching the scene unfold. "Completely. The cabin is visible from a public road, and Oregon is a one-party consent state for recording. We're documenting a delivery to property you legally own." As we watched, a silver BMW pulled into the driveway. A young blonde woman emerged, Vanessa, unmistakably the same woman from the photo Michael had sent. She was even younger looking in motion, maybe 24 at most, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and privilege. She directed the delivery men with animated gestures, pointing to various rooms inside the cabin. Moments later, a dark blue Audi, Michael's car, pulled in behind her. He stepped out, looking around furtively before approaching Vanessa and kissing her in full view of anyone who might be watching. "Perfect," Teresa murmured, taking screenshots. "He doesn't even have the sense to be discreet." We continued watching as more furniture was unloaded: a king-sized bed frame, a dining set, 2 leather armchairs, and numerous boxes. Michael signed the delivery forms and handed the men what appeared to be a substantial tip. "That's at least $15,000 worth of furniture," Teresa observed. "We'll get the exact invoice from the delivery company with a subpoena, but it's clear they're setting up house permanently, not just staying temporarily." Once the delivery truck departed, Michael and Vanessa celebrated with champagne on the deck, my deck, overlooking the lake view I'd fallen in love with when purchasing the property. The casual entitlement of it sent a wave of anger through me, so intense I had to look away. Oliver had constructed an impressive tower of blocks and was now showing it to Teresa's assistant with proud gestures. His complete absorption in his creation reminded me of how I used to lose myself in case preparations, finding flow in the detailed work of legal research and strategy development. "Teresa," I said, turning back to her, "I've been thinking about your job offer." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I want to accept, not just for the financial security, but because I think I need this, need to reclaim this part of myself." Teresa smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. We can work out a schedule that accommodates Oliver's needs. Start part-time if you want, then scale up. And your first project can be your own case. No one will fight harder for you than you will." The idea of actively participating in my own legal strategy, rather than being a passive client, shifted something fundamental in my perspective. This wasn't something happening to me anymore. It was something I was actively addressing, using skills I'd honed through years of education and practice. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Michael, using yet another phone. "Rachel, this has gone far enough. Mills says your lawyer is making unreasonable demands for financial disclosures. If you push this, we'll have no choice but to seek full custody. Oliver needs stability, not a mother obsessed with revenge." Handed the phone to Teresa. "Add this to the file of intimidation attempts." She read it and shook her head. "He's getting desperate. When men like Michael start making custody threats, it usually means they're worried about their financial exposure." "He won't get custody," I said with absolute certainty, watching Oliver arrange his dinosaurs in some complex pattern only he understood. He doesn't even know Oliver's schedule, his favorite foods, his allergies. Nothing. He's been an absentee, father for months. Exactly. And we have documentation of that too. His calendar invites, the university events he prioritized over Oliver's doctor appointments, his own emails complaining about how demanding parenting is. Bradford Mills can posture all he wants, but no family court judge will take a custody claim seriously from a father who can't name his child's pediatrician. The live feed from the cabin showed Michael and Vanessa now sitting close together on the deck, reviewing what appeared to be papers, probably designs for the renovations they planned for my property. The casual intimacy of the scene was painful to watch, but I forced myself to look. This was the reality I needed to face head-on. "Teresa," I said, still watching the feed, "do we know if Vanessa is pregnant? I found emails about private schools and a larger house. It seemed specific." Teresa's expression shifted. "My investigator is looking into that possibility. There was a charge on Michael's credit card at Portland Women's Clinic 2 weeks ago. It could be nothing, but..." The possibility landed like a stone in my stomach. Not because I couldn't bear the thought of Michael having another child. Our marriage was clearly over regardless. But because of the additional complexity it would add to our proceedings. A new baby would be one more argument for Michael to seek substantial assets, one more claim on resources that should be securing Oliver's future. If she is pregnant, Teresa continued, seeing my expression, it doesn't change the legal facts of your case. The cabin is still your inheritance property. The joint accounts he drained still represent marital assets he misappropriated. His financial misconduct still occurred. A new child might affect final support calculations, but not the fundamental issues of asset division. I nodded, watching Oliver as he abandoned his blocks to examine a colorful fish tank in the corner of Teresa's office. His boundless curiosity, his openness to new discoveries. These were qualities I needed to recultivate in myself. When Diane arrived to pick up Oliver for the afternoon, I knelt to say goodbye, holding him perhaps a little tighter than usual. Mommy has some important work to do, I told him, but I'll be home for dinner and bedtime stories. Be good for Miss Diane. As he toddled off, clutching Diane's hand and chattering about fish, I turned back to Teresa with renewed determination. Let's go get my cabin back. The courthouse stood as an imposing stone edifice in downtown Portland, its classical columns and broad steps projecting an air of permanence that felt reassuring as Teresa and I climbed toward the entrance. I had spent countless hours in courtrooms during my legal career, but never as a litigant in my own case. The role reversal felt strange, disorienting, yet oddly empowering. Judge Miranda Oakes is presiding today, Teresa said as we passed through. Security. She's fair, thorough, and doesn't tolerate theatrics. Bradford Mills knows this, which is why he'll try to establish a narrative of you as the emotional, irrational spouse early in the proceedings. I remember Judge Oakes, I replied, smoothing my jacket. She ruled on the Harrington case when I was still at Bennett and Phelps, detail-oriented and impossible to manipulate with emotional appeals. Teresa nodded approvingly. Exactly. So we stick to facts. The inheritance documentation, the separate agreement for the cabin, the financial records showing Michael's systematic draining of joint accounts, and the photographic evidence of him moving furniture into your property, we sigh. Turned a corner, and there they were, Michael and Bradford Mills, heads bent in conversation at the end of the hallway. Michael looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since sending that devastating email. For a moment, something like guilt flashed across his face, before his expression hardened into a mask of determination. Mills, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and radiating expensive confidence, placed a restraining hand on Michael's arm when he made a move to approach us. Instead, Mills himself walked over, extending his hand to Teresa. Teresa. Always a pleasure to face a worthy opponent, he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. Bradford, Teresa replied coolly, accepting the handshake briefly. I hope your client has been forthcoming about the inheritance status of the property in question. It could save us all considerable time. Mills smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. We have a different interpretation of the documentation, as you'll see, and given Professor Winter's need for a stable work environment to meet his publishing deadlines that will benefit the family financially, we believe temporary possession is reasonable and necessary. The family? I couldn't stop myself from responding. You mean my husband and the woman he's moved into my property? That family? Mills turned to me, his expression carefully modulated to convey sympathy that never reached his calculating eyes. Mrs. Winters, I understand emotions are running high right now, but I hope we can all focus on pragmatic solutions rather than recriminations. Teresa subtly touched my elbow, a silent reminder to stay strategic rather than emotional. I took a deep breath, regaining my composure. Mr. Mills, I'm focused entirely on pragmatic solutions, specifically the return of my property and the marital assets that were misappropriated. As attorneys, I believe we can both appreciate the importance of respecting legal ownership and financial disclosure requirements. Something shifted in Mill's assessment of me. I saw it in the slight narrowing of his eyes. He had expected a distraught wife, not a composed attorney speaking his language. Indeed, he replied after a moment. Well, we'll present our respective positions to Judge Oaks shortly. He retreated to where Michael stood watching our exchange, visible anxiety tightening his features. I caught fragments of their hushed conversation. Didn't tell me she would be so, and shift strategy to... Teresa guided me toward our designated courtroom. Perfect response, she murmured. You've already disrupted their narrative. Mills expected to face an emotional, vindictive spouse he could paint as irrational. Instead, he got a colleague speaking his language. Courtroom 304 was already busy with the day's emergency hearings and temporary orders. We settled into seats, near the front, reviewing our documentation one final time while waiting for our case to be called. 20 minutes later, the bailiff announced, Winters v. Winters, emergency motion regarding property rights and financial restraining orders. We approached the bench, taking our positions at opposite tables. Judge Oaks, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating eyes, reviewed the filings before her. I understand we have competing emergency motions here, she began, looking over her reading glasses at both legal teams. Mrs. Winters seeks financial restraining orders and confirmation of separate property rights to a cabin in Bend, while Professor Winters requests temporary exclusive possession of that same property for professional purposes. Ms. Hayes, please. Present your client's position first. Teresa rose, the picture of professional composure. Your Honor, the facts in this case are straightforward. The property in question, a cabin near Bend, Oregon, was purchased using funds from Rachel Winters' inheritance from her grandmother Margaret Sullivan. While the deed does list both parties, a separate legal agreement executed at the time of purchase clearly establishes the cabin as separate property belonging to Mrs. Winters. She presented the inheritance documentation and the separate agreement, which the clerk delivered to Judge Oaks. The judge examined them carefully while Teresa continued. Furthermore, we have evidence that Professor Winters has systematically drained joint marital accounts in preparation for filing for divorce, transferring approximately $125,000 to accounts in his name only. We also have photographic evidence from this morning showing Professor Winters and his paramour, Vanessa Thornfield, moving substantial new furniture into the property, clearly intending permanent rather than temporary occupation. Judge Oaks looked up at this. You have photographs from today? Yes, Your Honor. Teresa presented the time-stamped photos from her investigator, showing Michael and Vanessa supervising the furniture delivery at the cabin. These were taken legally from a public road this morning. As you can see, this is not a temporary work arrangement but a complete household being established. I watched Michael's face as the photos were presented. He paled visibly, whispering urgently to Mills, who maintained his professional poker face despite what must have been an unwelcome surprise. When Teresa concluded, Mills rose with practiced smoothness. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the cabin was purchased during the marriage, my client contests the characterization of this property as separate inheritance. Professor Winters has contributed significantly to the property's maintenance and improvement, creating a commingling of assets that transforms it into marital property. He continued, elaborating on Michael's need for a quiet workspace to complete his book, a project he claimed would ultimately benefit our family financially. Judge Oaks listened attentively, but interrupted when Mills attempted to characterize me as vindictively preventing Michael from fulfilling his professional obligations. Mr. Mills, please stick to legal arguments rather than characterizations of motive, she said firmly. When both sides had presented their arguments, Judge Oaks reviewed the documentation once more before delivering her ruling. Based on the evidence before me, I find the separate property agreement regarding the cabin to be valid and enforceable. The documentation clearly establishes that the funds used to purchase this property came from Mrs. Winters' inheritance and the agreement signed by both parties at the time of purchase confirms their mutual understanding of its separate property status. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but maintained my professional demeanor as the judge continued. Therefore, I am granting Mrs. Winters' motion for exclusive possession of the cabin property. Professor Winters and any individuals residing with him must vacate the premises within 48 hours, removing only personal effects, not furniture or fixtures. Any damage to the property during the removal process will be subject to financial penalty. She turned to the financial matters next. Regarding the joint accounts, I am issuing a temporary restraining order, freezing all accounts associated with both parties until a full accounting can be conducted. Professor Winters is ordered to provide complete financial disclosures, including all accounts domestic and foreign, within 7 days. The $125,000 removed from joint accounts must be placed in an escrow account managed by the court pending final distribution. Mills immediately objected, arguing that Michael needed access to those funds for living expenses and legal fees. Judge Oakes considered this. The court will release $5,000 for immediate living expenses, but the remainder stays in escrow. For legal fees, Professor Winters' substantial university salary should be sufficient for retainer purposes. She looked pointedly at Mills's expensive suit, a subtle acknowledgement of his high fees. With a final strike of her gavel, Judge Oakes concluded the hearing. Further motions regarding asset division and support payments will be addressed at the preliminary hearing scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Both parties are reminded of their obligation to preserve all marital assets pending final resolution. As we gathered our materials to leave, I felt strangely calm, vindicated by this first victory, but aware that it was merely the opening move in what would likely be a protracted battle. In the hallway outside, Michael broke away from Mills and approached me directly, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Rachel, this is unnecessary hostility," he said, keeping his voice low. "We could have worked this out privately without lawyers and judges." I regarded him steadily, maintaining the professional composure I'd cultivated in court. "Like how you worked out moving your girlfriend into my cabin privately? Or how you worked out emptying our joint accounts without discussion? That kind of private resolution?" His face flushed. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Think about Oliver." "I am thinking about Oliver," I replied, my voice, even despite the anger churning inside me. "I'm thinking about the college fund you emptied. I'm thinking about securing his future since his father clearly prioritized his girlfriend's comfort over his son's financial security." Teresa stepped forward before Michael could respond. "Professor Winters, all communication should go through counsel from this point forward. Please instruct your attorney to contact me directly regarding any matters related to the divorce proceedings or temporary arrangements." Mills appeared at Michael's side, smoothly steering him away. "We'll be in touch, Teresa, and we'll be addressing the custody arrangements at the next hearing." Once they were out of earshot, Teresa turned to me with a satisfied smile. "First, round to us. The judge's ruling on the cabin was definitive, and the financial restraining order is exactly what we wanted." "But they're still going to fight on custody," I said, watching Michael and Mills retreat down the hallway. "Of course they are," Teresa replied. "It's standard strategy. Threaten what matters most to negotiate concessions on financial matters. But we're well prepared for that battle, too." As we left the courthouse, my phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Oliver and I are having a great afternoon at the Children's Museum. He built an amazing block tower and has been telling everyone about it. No worries, take your time." I showed the message to Teresa with a smile. "This is why Michael won't win on custody. While he's moving furniture into my cabin with his girlfriend, I've arranged enriching activities for our son with a caregiver who adores him and documents everything." "Exactly," Teresa agreed. "Now, what's our next move?" "I need to secure our home," I said decisively. "Michael still has keys, and after today's ruling, I'm concerned about what he might do out of spite." Teresa nodded. Good thinking. I'll call a locksmith who works with our clients, someone discreet who understands divorce situations. And we should set up a security system if you don't already have one. Already researching options, I replied, showing her the home security company website I'd been browsing on my phone. I want cameras at all entry points, with footage backed up to the cloud. Teresa's approval was evident. You're thinking like an attorney again already. Documentation. Is everything in these cases? By late afternoon, a locksmith had changed all the locks on our Portland home, and a security technician was installing a comprehensive system with motion-activated cameras covering every entrance. I watched them work with a sense of security I hadn't felt since opening Michael's email yesterday morning. Was it truly only yesterday? It felt like weeks had passed. I used the time while the technicians worked to call my bank and credit card companies, removing Michael's access and establishing new accounts where necessary. With each call, each form signed, I reclaimed another piece of my financial independence. When Diane brought Oliver home around 5, he was full of excited stories about his day at the museum. I listened attentively, marveling at his resilience and adaptability. To him, this was just another day. Different, perhaps, but not tragic or life-altering as it had been for me. Mommy got some work done today, too, I told him as I prepared. Is dinner. Important work to make sure we're safe and happy. Where's Daddy? He asked suddenly, the question I'd been dreading. I knelt to his level, meeting his curious eyes directly. Daddy is staying somewhere else right now. Mommy and Daddy are going to live in different houses, but we both love you very much. Nothing will change that. He seemed to consider this for a moment before asking, Can I have mac and cheese for dinner? The simplicity of his response was both heartbreaking and reassuring. Children adapted. They focused on what mattered in their immediate experience. Mac and cheese mattered. The details of adult relationships did not. At least not yet. As I stirred pasta on the stove, my phone rang with a call from Teresa. Rachel, we've hit something interesting. The investigator tracked down the furniture delivery company. The invoice for today's delivery was over $32,000, paid in full last week from an account we haven't identified yet. But here's the interesting part. The shipping label listed the buyer as Thornfield Publishing Holdings, not Michael or Vanessa personally. Richard Thornfield's company is buying furniture for their love nest? I asked, surprised. Looks that way. And that raises significant questions about the relationship between Michael's grant, his affair with Vanessa, and Richard Thornfield's involvement. We're digging deeper, but I wanted you to know the financial entanglement appears more complex than we initially thought. After thanking Teresa and ending the call, I served Oliver his dinner and sat beside him, my mind racing with implications. If Richard Thornfield was financially supporting Michael and Vanessa's relationship, buying furniture, potentially facilitating questionable grants, there might be professional ethical issues involved beyond our divorce proceedings. The security technician finished his work as we were finishing dinner, providing me with access codes and demonstrating the smartphone app that would allow me to monitor our home from anywhere. Another layer of protection established. Another step toward rebuilding security for Oliver and myself. As I bathed Oliver and prepared him for bed, I thought about the contrast between the chaos of my inner emotional landscape and the methodical external steps I was taking to secure our future. Each action, changing locks, installing security, freezing accounts, documenting evidence, was a tangible move toward stability. Once Oliver was asleep, I sat at my desk with the file of evidence I'd been compiling, a folder that grew thicker by the hour as new information emerged. The cabin was secure for now. The financial bleeding had been stopped by the court order. Now it was time to understand the full scope of what Michael had done and why. I opened my laptop and began a detailed timeline of events, cross-referencing Michael's emails with financial transactions and known meetings with Vanessa and her father. patterns emerged that raised troubling questions about when and how their relationship had begun, and whether Michael's academic work and grant funding had been compromised by his personal involvement with the Thornfields. This wasn't just about a marriage ending anymore. It was about uncovering the truth behind a calculated deception that spanned personal betrayal, financial misconduct, and potentially professional ethical violations. As I worked late into the night, organizing evidence and formulating questions for our investigator to pursue, I realized that Michael's attempt to discard me had inadvertently reawakened the very part of me he had underestimated: the strategic, meticulous attorney who had once made a living uncovering hidden truths and constructing airtight cases. That woman hadn't disappeared when I stepped back from my career to raise our son. She had merely been waiting for the moment when her skills would be needed most urgently. That moment had arrived, and I was ready. The morning after our court victory brought unexpected consequences. I woke to the insistent chime of my phone, 17 missed calls, and a flood of text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Scrolling through them with growing alarm, I realized they shared a common theme: reporters seeking comment on the scandalous divorce of Professor Michael Winters. Somehow, our private legal battle had become public overnight. "Have you seen the university newsletter?" Teresa's voice was tense when I called her. Someone leaked details of yesterday's hearing, including the photos of Michael and Vanessa at the cabin. I quickly found the online faculty newsletter on my laptop. There it was, prominently featured: English department professor in contentious divorce amid allegations of misconduct. The article included surprisingly specific details about Michael's relationship with Vanessa Thornfield, described as the daughter of prominent publisher Richard Thornfield, whose company recently awarded Professor Winters a substantial research grant. "This wasn't us," I said firmly. "We haven't spoken to anyone." "I know," Teresa replied. "My guess? Richard Thornfield is doing damage control. By framing this as a simple divorce rather than potential academic impropriety, he's trying to get ahead of any ethics investigation." I skimmed the rest of the article, which subtly portrayed Michael as a dedicated academic whose personal life had unfortunately become complicated. It made no mention of drained bank accounts or misappropriated inheritance property. "There's more," Teresa continued. "The university president has called an emergency meeting of the ethics committee for tomorrow. Apparently, several faculty members raised concerns about the grant after seeing this article. This complicated our situation considerably. While Michael's academic problems were separate from our divorce proceedings, any findings of professional misconduct could impact his financial status, and by extension, his ability to provide support for Oliver. What should we do?" I asked, watching Oliver arrange colorful magnets on the refrigerator door, blissfully unaware of the growing storm. "Nothing publicly," Teresa advised. "Let the university handle the professional aspects. Our focus remains on the divorce proceedings and protecting your interests. Speaking of which, have you checked your email this morning?" I hadn't. Opening my inbox revealed a formal settlement offer from Bradford Mills. The terms were breathtaking in their audacity. Michael would generously allow me to keep the Portland house, which was already jointly owned, in exchange for full ownership of the cabin, 60% of all marital assets, and a custody arrangement giving him Oliver 3 days each week once he was settled in his new residence. "Is he serious?" I asked Teresa, my voice tight with disbelief. "It's a standard aggressive opening position," she replied calmly. "Mills always starts with outrageous demands, hoping you'll be so relieved by later concessions that you'll accept terms still heavily favoring his client. We'll respond with our counter-proposal this afternoon." After hanging up, I focused on giving Oliver a normal morning routine: breakfast, playtime, stories, while my mind processed this new development. The public exposure added an unwelcome dimension to our divorce. Michael had always been protective of his academic reputation. How would he react to having it threatened? My answer came shortly after noon when Michael himself appeared at our front door, visible through the security camera I'd installed yesterday. He rang the bell repeatedly, his expression growing increasingly agitated when I didn't immediately answer. I activated the intercom feature. "Michael, all communication needs to go through our attorneys." "Rachel, open the door." His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "This isn't about the divorce. The university is questioning my grant funding because of your vindictive court filing." "My court filing was sealed," I replied evenly. "I didn't speak to anyone at the university." "Someone did," he snapped. "And now my career is at risk. You need to make this right. You created this situation, not me. Please contact Teresa with any concerns." I ended the conversation and called campus security, informing them that my estranged husband was making unwelcome contact, despite legal instructions to communicate only through attorneys. Michael left before security arrived, but the encounter left me shaken. Not from fear, the new security system made me feel physically safe, but from the realization that Michael truly believed I should help protect his reputation despite his betrayal. His sense of entitlement was staggering. An hour later, I received a call from an unexpected source. Dean Eleanor Patterson from the university's English department. "Mrs. Winters, I apologize for contacting you directly," she began, her tone professional but kind. "I understand you're going through a difficult personal situation. However, the Ethics Committee has requested information about the Westlake publishing grant awarded to your husband, and I was hoping you might provide some context." I chose my words carefully. "Dean Patterson, while I appreciate your position, I'm not comfortable discussing matters related to ongoing legal proceedings. My attorney, Teresa Hayes, would be happy to determine what information we can appropriately share." The dean seemed to respect this boundary. "Of course, I understand. Please have Ms. Hayes contact my office at her earliest convenience. And Mrs. Winters, off the record, I want you to know that many of us in the department have been concerned about Professor Winters' grant situation for some time. The circumstances seemed unusual. After providing Teresa's contact information, I ended the call with a new perspective on Michael's professional standing. If the dean herself had harbored concerns before our divorce became public, perhaps Michael's academic situation was more precarious than I'd realized. Teresa called again while Oliver was napping. "Rachel, our investigator uncovered something significant. Remember the Cayman Islands account? We've traced deposits totaling $350,000 coming from Thornfield Publishing's corporate account, transferred in 3 installments over the past 4 months. That's not a normal grant distribution method," I observed, the attorney in me immediately recognizing the red flags. "Exactly. Legitimate academic grants don't flow through offshore accounts. We're looking at potential tax evasion, misappropriation of corporate funds, or possibly even academic fraud, if the grant was for work Michael never intended to complete." This revelation shifted the landscape dramatically. What I'd initially viewed as a personal betrayal had much broader implications. If Michael and the Thornfields were involved in financial impropriety, the divorce complications would multiply exponentially. "What does this mean for our case?" I asked. "It strengthens our position considerably," Teresa explained. "If Michael is implicated in financial misconduct, the court will view his actions regarding marital assets even more severely. But it also means we need to proceed carefully. These aren't just wealthy individuals we're dealing with. Thornfield Publishing is a major corporation with significant legal resources." After our call, I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the growing file of evidence while Oliver continued his nap. The complexity of Michael's deception was staggering. What had begun as an affair had evolved into a sophisticated scheme involving offshore accounts, questionable grants, and corporate funds. I found myself analyzing the situation as I would have approached a complex legal case in my former practice, identifying key players, mapping financial flows, establishing timelines and anticipating countermoves. The skills I'd set aside when focusing on motherhood returned with surprising fluidity. My phone chimed with a text from Diane. "Just saw the university newsletter. Are you okay? Need any extra help with Oliver this week?" Her message reminded me that our private drama was now public knowledge. Colleagues, friends, neighbors, everyone in our social circle would be aware of Michael's affair and our impending divorce. The thought was momentarily overwhelming, but I pushed through it. Public opinion was the least of my concerns right now, I texted back. "We're managing, thank you. Might need extra hours next week for legal meetings." When Oliver woke from his nap, I took him to the neighborhood park, deliberately choosing a routine activity in a public space. I wouldn't hide away as if ashamed. As we played on the swings, I noticed several parents glancing in my direction, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. News traveled fast in academic circles. One mother, Amanda, whose daughter attended the same playgroup as Oliver, approached us directly. "Rachel, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what you're going through," she said quietly while our children played in the sandbox. "The way that newsletter article was written, it didn't seem fair to you." "Thank you," I replied simply. "We're taking things one day at a time. If you need anything, childcare, a meal train, whatever, just say the word. Several of us are happy to help." Her kindness was unexpected and touching. I'd been so focused on legal strategies and financial protections that I'd overlooked the importance of community support. "I appreciate that more than you know," I told her honestly. By the time we returned home, Teresa had sent our formal response to Bradford Mills's settlement proposal. Our counteroffer was straightforward. I would retain the cabin as my separate property. We would split the marital assets equally, after returning the $125,000 Michael had removed from joint accounts. And we proposed a parenting plan reflecting Oliver's established routines, with Michael having visitation on weekends and one weeknight. "This is more generous than many judges would award given the circumstances," Teresa had noted in her accompanying email. "Mrs. Winters is prioritizing Oliver's relationship with his father despite Professor Winters' actions." As I prepared dinner, for Oliver, the security system alerted me to another visitor. Not Michael this time, but a young woman I immediately recognized as Vanessa Thornfield. My finger hovered over the intercom button as I debated whether to acknowledge her presence. Curiosity won out. "Yes?" I asked through the intercom. "Mrs. Winters?" Her voice was higher than I'd expected, almost girlish. "I'm Vanessa. I think we should talk, woman to woman." The audacity was breathtaking. "Any communication should go through our respective attorneys," I replied evenly. "This isn't about legal stuff," she persisted. "It's about Michael. There are things you should know. Things that might help everyone move forward more amicably." Was this an attempted manipulation or a genuine overture? Either way, engaging directly with her violated the clear boundaries Teresa had established. "I'm not interested in an amicable conversation with the woman who was photographed in my inheritance property without my permission," I responded, struggling to maintain my professional tone. "Please leave my property immediately." She lingered, on the porch for nearly a minute before finally returning to her car, an expensive Audi convertible that probably cost more than a year of Michael's professor salary. As she drove away, I wondered what things I should know she had planned to share. A pregnancy announcement? Threats regarding Richard Thornfield's influence? Whatever it was, it could be properly communicated through legal channels. I called Teresa to report the unexpected visit. "Document it," she advised immediately. Time, duration, what was said. This could constitute harassment if it continues. "Do you think they're getting desperate?" I asked. "It's a possibility. The university investigation, the financial disclosures, ordered by the court, our counterproposal that reveals we won't be intimidated. They're feeling pressure from multiple directions." People often make mistakes when they're desperate. After putting Oliver to bed, I sat down at my laptop and methodically documented every interaction, every phone call, every text message related to the divorce proceedings. The file was becoming substantial, a detailed record of Michael's actions and my responses that would prove invaluable if the case went to trial. As I worked, an email notification appeared, a message from Dean Patterson to both Michael and me, copied to the university's legal counsel. The ethics committee had scheduled Michael's hearing for Friday morning at 9 a.m. Both of us were invited to attend and provide relevant information regarding the Westlake Publishing grant. The university was moving quickly, presumably concerned about potential scandal affecting their reputation. This accelerated timeline would increase pressure on Michael and the Thornfields, potentially forcing hasty decisions that might benefit our divorce proceedings. I forwarded the email to Teresa with a simple question: should I attend? Her response came quickly. Absolutely. Not to speak unless specifically addressed, but your presence alone sends a message that you have nothing to hide. I'll accompany you. That night, as I reviewed our growing documentation and prepared notes, for Friday's ethics hearing, I recognized that we had moved beyond the initial shock of betrayal into a new phase of this conflict. The stakes had expanded beyond our marriage and divorce to include professional reputations, corporate finances, and potentially even legal consequences beyond family court. Michael had clearly underestimated what his actions would unleash. When he'd sent that smug email with the photo of himself and Vanessa at my cabin, he'd apparently believed I would collapse in hurt and confusion, allowing him to dictate the terms of our separation. Instead, he'd awakened the strategic attorney I'd once been, and now that attorney was methodically dismantling the house of cards he'd built with Vanessa and her father. The complication and escalation of our conflict hadn't weakened my position as Michael might have hoped. Instead, each new revelation strengthened my resolve and clarified my path forward. While Michael scrambled to manage the expanding consequences of his choices, I was building a case that would secure Oliver's future and restore what had been taken from us. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since opening that devastating email, I fell asleep feeling confident, rather than shattered. The path ahead was difficult, but I could see it clearly now, and I was more than capable of navigating it. The University Ethics Committee hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the administration building's formal conference room. Teresa and I arrived 20 minutes early, giving us time to observe the participants as they arrived. We sat quietly in the antechamber, reviewing our documentation one final time. Remember, Teresa whispered, you're here as an observer, unless directly questioned. Let the committee's process unfold naturally. I nodded, adjusting my navy blue suit jacket. I'd dressed carefully that morning, professional but understated, the image of composed dignity rather than vengeful spouse. Appearance shouldn't matter in legal proceedings, but human psychology made it inevitable. At 8:50, Michael arrived with Bradford Mills. They both faltered momentarily upon seeing me, clearly not expecting my presence. Michael looked haggard, with shadows under his eyes and his usually meticulous appearance showing signs of strain. He attempted to approach us, but Mills steered him to seats on the opposite side of the waiting area. Minutes later, Richard Thornfield entered, accompanied by a severe-looking woman in an expensive charcoal suit whom I recognized as Catherine Doyle, General Counsel for Thornfield Publishing. The tension in the room amplified with their arrival. Richard glanced nervously between Michael and me before taking a seat beside his attorney. Notably absent was Vanessa. Either she hadn't been invited or had chosen to distance herself from the proceedings. At precisely 9 SUC, Dean Patterson appeared to escort us into the conference room. 7 committee members sat at a long mahogany table, their expressions uniformly serious. Nameplates identified them as senior faculty and administrators from various departments, none from English to avoid conflicts of interest. This is an informal fact-finding hearing, Dean Patterson began after introductions. The committee is investigating concerns raised about the Westlake Publishing grant awarded to Professor Winters and related matters of potential ethical violations. This is not a disciplinary proceeding at this stage, merely an information gathering exercise. Despite her reassuring words, the atmosphere was undeniably tense. University counsel sat at one end of the table, taking notes and occasionally whispering to the committee chair. "Professor Winters," the chair began, "please explain the genesis and purpose of your research grant from Westlake Publishing." Michael leaned forward, his voice steady despite his disheveled appearance. "The grant was awarded to support my book project on contemporary American literature's response to digital media. Westlake Publishing has a legitimate academic interest in this research area, as they're expanding their digital publishing division." "And how did this grant opportunity come to your attention?" the chair asked. Michael hesitated, glancing at Mills. "Through normal professional channels. I've had a relationship with Westlake for several years, having reviewed manuscripts for them previously." A committee member consulted her notes. "Our records indicate the grant was approved outside Westlake's normal academic funding cycle and did not go through their standard peer review process. Can you explain why your project received this exceptional treatment?" The question hung in the air as Michael struggled to formulate a response. Richard Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The timeliness of the research required expedited funding, Michael finally answered. "Digital publishing trends move quickly." "I see," the committee member replied skeptically. "And when did you first meet Ms. Vanessa Thornfield?" Michael's composure slipped visibly. "I don't see how my personal life is relevant to this academic matter." The committee chair leaned forward. "Professor Winters, when a substantial grant is awarded outside normal channels by a company whose CEO's daughter you are now in a relationship with, the timeline becomes extremely relevant to questions of academic integrity and conflicts of interest." Bradford Mills attempted to intervene. "My client's personal relationships developed entirely separately from any professional arrangements." The university council spoke for the first time. "Mr. Mills, while we respect your role in Professor Winters' divorce proceedings, this is a university ethics matter. The committee needs factual answers to establish the timeline of events." Cornered, Michael admitted meeting Vanessa at a faculty reception in September, but insisted their relationship had developed months after the grant was approved. When Richard Thornfield was questioned, his account contradicted Michael's in several key areas, particularly regarding when discussions about the grant had begun. The committee methodically highlighted these discrepancies, creating a timeline that strongly suggested the grant had been discussed after Michael and Vanessa had already become involved. I sat silently throughout this exchange, observing as Michael's carefully constructed narrative unraveled under scrutiny. Teresa occasionally made notes, but otherwise remained equally passive, allowing the committee's investigation to reveal what our own research had already uncovered. Nearly 2 hours into the hearing, the committee chair finally turned to me. "Mrs. Winters, we appreciate your attendance today. Do you have any information regarding the grant or related financial matters that might be relevant to our inquiry?" This was the moment Teresa and I had prepared for. I spoke clearly and calmly, keeping my response factual rather than emotional. As part of ongoing divorce proceedings, financial investigations have revealed that approximately $350,000 was transferred from Thornfield Publishing corporate accounts to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands controlled by my husband. These transfers began shortly after the official grant was awarded and continued until very recently. My attorney has provided documentation of these transfers to University Counsel. The revelation landed like a bombshell. Richard Thornfield's face drained of color, while Michael stared at me in shock, clearly unaware that I had uncovered the offshore accounts. These transfers were separate from, and in addition to the official $200,000 grant, I continued. "And did not appear in any university financial disclosures. The committee chair turned to university counsel, who nodded confirmation that they had indeed received this documentation. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably as the potential severity of the situation became clear to everyone present. In light of this information, the chair announced after a brief consultation with other committee members, we will need to expand our investigation and consult with external auditors. This hearing is adjourned until further notice. Professor Winters, we request that you provide complete access to all financial records related to the grant and any other Thornfield Publishing transactions within 48 hours. As we filed out of the conference room, the stunned silence spoke volumes. Michael attempted to catch my eye, but I maintained my focus forward, preserving the professional composure I'd maintained throughout the hearing. In the parking lot, Teresa squeezed my arm encouragingly. Perfect execution. You presented just the facts, no accusations or emotional content. The committee will draw their own conclusions. What happens now? I asked as we reached her car. Now we wait. But this changes the landscape of our divorce proceedings significantly. Mills will be desperate to settle before the university investigation potentially impacts Michael's employment status. She was right. Less than 3 hours later, my phone rang with a call from Teresa. Bradford Mills just contacted me, she said, barely containing her satisfaction. They want to discuss an amicable resolution to all outstanding matters. Apparently, Richard Thornfield is also eager to resolve the situation quickly and quietly. How generous of them, I replied dryly. What are they offering? Full return of all funds removed from joint accounts, complete surrender of any claim to the cabin, and a support arrangement for Oliver that's actually more generous than what we initially proposed. They're also offering to cover all your legal fees. The swift capitulation was stunning but not entirely surprising. With careers and potentially even legal freedom at stake, Michael and the Thornfields were cutting their losses. They have one condition, Teresa continued. They want a non-disclosure agreement covering the offshore accounts and any personal matters related to the divorce. I considered this carefully. While the financial terms were excellent, I hesitated at the idea of allowing Michael and the Thornfields to bury their misconduct. The university already has the information about the offshore transfers, I pointed out. A non-disclosure agreement between us wouldn't prevent their investigation. True, Teresa agreed, but it would prevent you from speaking about it publicly, or providing additional details to other interested parties, like the IRS or financial regulators. The attorney in me recognized the ethical dilemma. Should I accept favorable settlement terms in exchange for silence about potential financial misconduct? Or did I have a broader ethical obligation to ensure transparency? Let me think about it, I told Teresa. I'll call you back in an hour. I spent that hour playing with Oliver in our backyard, watching him chase butterflies with boundless enthusiasm. His future security was my priority. The settlement offer would ensure he was financially protected, regardless of what happened with Michael's career or the Thornfield publishing empire. Yet something about accepting silence in exchange for favorable terms felt wrong, a betrayal of the principles I'd once upheld as an attorney and still valued as a person. When I called Teresa back, my decision was clear. Counteroffer. I'll accept a limited non-disclosure covering personal details of our marriage and divorce, but not any financial transactions involving Thornfield Publishing corporate funds or the offshore accounts. They need to face whatever consequences come from the university investigation and any regulatory review. Teresa was quiet for a moment. They won't like that. Then they shouldn't have misappropriated corporate funds or hidden money offshore, I replied simply. I won't help cover up financial misconduct, even for a favorable settlement. 3 anxious hours later, Teresa called back. They've accepted your terms with one modification. The non-disclosure will cover specific details of the offshore accounts, but not their existence or general purpose. The university investigation can proceed unimpeded. It was a reasonable compromise that protected my ethical concerns while still securing Oliver's future. I can live with that, I agreed. The settlement agreement was drafted and signed within 48 hours, record speed for a divorce involving significant assets. Michael surrendered all claims to the cabin, returned the money taken from joint accounts, plus interest, agreed to generous child support, and accepted a custody arrangement that preserved Oliver's routine while allowing Michael regular visitation once he secured stable housing. In exchange, I agreed not to publicly discuss the personal details of our separation or the specific amounts and transaction details of the offshore accounts. The university's investigation could continue without my additional input, but I would not actively volunteer information to financial authorities. As I signed the final documents in Teresa's office, a weight lifted that I hadn't fully recognized until its absence. The battle was over, and we had secured everything that truly mattered: Oliver's future, my inheritance property, and financial stability. "What will you do now?" Teresa asked as we completed the paperwork. "First, take Oliver to the cabin for a long weekend. It needs to be reclaimed as our special place again." I smiled at the thought of watching my son explore the lakefront property. That was now securely ours. "Then I'm going to seriously consider your job offer. I think it's time Rachel Winters, attorney at law, made her come back." Teresa beamed. "Our family law division would be lucky to have you. And I know several clients who could benefit from an attorney who understands both the legal and emotional complexities of high-conflict divorce." 2 days later, Oliver and I drove to the cabin. I'd had it professionally cleaned, removing all traces of Michael and Vanessa's brief occupation. As we arrived, the late afternoon sun glinted off the lake, creating a shimmer of possibility across the water. Oliver raced excitedly toward the shoreline, eager to throw pebbles into the water, a simple pleasure untainted by the adult complications that had swirled around this property. While he played, I walked through the cabin, reclaiming each space with new plans and intentions. The deck where Michael and Vanessa had celebrated with champagne would become Oliver's art space, with an easel for painting lakeside sunsets. The living room they had furnished with expensive leather would instead feature comfortable, child-friendly seating for reading stories and building blanket forts. As I stood watching Oliver from the deck, my phone buzzed with a news alert from the university paper. "Ethics investigation results in professor's resignation and return of grant funds." Michael had resigned his position, effective immediately, and Westlake Publishing had agreed to return all grant funds pending a complete review of their academic funding programs. I felt no satisfaction in Michael's professional downfall, only a sense that justice had taken its natural course. Actions had consequences, sometimes far beyond what was initially envisioned when sending a smug email with a photograph meant to devastate. 1 month later, I officially joined Teresa's law firm as a family law attorney, specializing in complex financial cases and inheritance disputes. My experience had given me unique insight into the challenges faced by clients navigating divorce with substantial assets or complicated financial situations. Michael eventually relocated to Boston, where he secured an adjunct teaching position at a small college, a significant step down from his tenured professorship. Our communications became strictly limited to matters involving Oliver, and over time evolved into a workable, if distant, co-parenting relationship. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Vanessa had ended shortly after the ethics investigation concluded. Apparently, Richard Thornfield had not appreciated the scrutiny brought to his company's financial practices, nor the resulting regulatory attention. As for me, I discovered that rebuilding after betrayal wasn't just about survival, it was about rediscovering strength I'd always possessed but temporarily forgotten. The email that had shattered my world had actually set me free in unexpected ways, reconnecting me with the confident, strategic woman who had been temporarily overshadowed by domestic life. I kept that email, It's saved in a secure folder in my personal archives, not out of bitterness or as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of a critical life lesson. Never underestimate a woman who knows her worth and understands the law. The cabin became our special retreat, a symbol of resilience rather than betrayal. On weekends, Oliver and I built sandcastles by the lake, roasted marshmallows under starlit skies, and created new memories untainted by what had happened before. And sometimes, in the quiet evenings after Oliver was asleep, I would sit on the deck with a glass of wine, looking out over the peaceful water, and silently thank Michael for making the miscalculation that ultimately led me back to myself, led me